Welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV, the live TV show all about the legal aspects of your business to help educate you on complex legal terms in an easy to understand manner, to help understand why you need to do certain things in your business from a legal point of view, and to help you develop a plan for the future. Our mission at Business Legal Lifecycle is to help empower all small to medium-sized businesses around the world to get access to legal advice so that they can help build their communities and make the world a better place. Did you know that any business owner is on average 7 months away from losing everything? That is the average time it takes from a successful business to fold when an aspect of their business is not set up correctly. Have you ever wanted to get legal advice but didn't understand what was going on? Do you feel like there is a divide between lawyers and their clients? Then this TV show is for you. It is all about empowering you and your business with the knowledge and tools to ensure that this doesn't happen to you. Business Legal Lifecycle TV delivers a twice-weekly show focusing on the legal aspects of your business. At lunchtime on Mondays, we present Fast Fix Monday, a quick 5 to 10 minute show that will give you some actionable steps to consider for the week for your business. And at lunchtime on Wednesdays, we present our in-depth show of between 30 minutes and an hour, where we go through complicated legal aspects of your business in a simple to understand, plain English manner. And whether that is...
Welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV. Today is Wednesday, so it's one of our longer form education shows today. And we're talking about startup in terms of starting up your business and some of the things you need to have in place. So it's August 2018. Today is the 1st of August, so we're moving on to a new phase of the Business Legal Lifecycle, and that is what I just said, which is startup. So, Jeremy, do you want to explain a little bit more about that and just touch on what we're going to talk about today?
Sounds good. Thanks, Craig. So, yeah, as you said, Phase 2 startup is what the theme of this month is going to be. This is the second time we've done this phase, and so we're going to focus a lot more on some specifics with the education show and just give you a bunch of information that you'll be able to use. This episode will be heavy on content. So just bear with us, but there's a lot of important stuff to get through. Phase 2 is probably the most content-heavy part of the business legal lifecycle, and you'll know that if you've read my book. So I've brought up for people who are watching the Facebook Live, Periscope, or YouTube, that the business legal lifecycle, and you'll see that Phase 2 is startup, and that comes straight after conception. So this is really about getting everything right at the beginning of your business. And if you get everything right at the beginning of your business, you're really going to be able to set things up properly for the future success of your business. So, as we said, today's there's a title card. Today is startup, and we're going to go through 7 topics. And as I said, there is a bit of content here, but just bear with us because it's all really important information that we want to make sure we get across to you that will help you set up and structure a great business. So the first topic that Craig's going to talk about is personal liability. And this is really important from understanding why we talk about startup and structures, which is the second topic, is structures. And we're going to go through and explain the main type of structures that people use in business. The third topic will be leases. And this is really important for businesses that need to set up a lease. And we're going to go through a bit of the process of getting a lease. Now, some businesses don't need a lease, but a lot of them still do. So we want to cover that off so that you understand what you're looking for in a lease and the kind of process that you're going to have to go through. The fourth topic is insurance, and this is really important. This is about having the right protections in place for you and your business so that you can be protected if something goes wrong, because there's many things that can happen that are completely outside your control, and we want to make sure that you're covered off on those. The next one is very important. It's government regulation. That's topic 5. And closely tied into government regulation is tax. So those 2 topics we're going to go through it in a bit of detail so that you can understand the different avenues for government regulation and tax. And the last topic, if you're watching us, is number 7, grants and funding. So we want to, in the startup phase, we want to have a think about the grants and funding. So yeah, without any further ado, I'll hand over to Craig to talk about personal liability.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeremy. And as Jeremy said, there are a few topics we're going through today. If you've got any questions about anything, please let us know. We won't be able to go through every single element in detail today, obviously. But if you've got a question about something specific or something we didn't touch on, please let us know. So you should have a slide up there, personal liability. And how can you be personally liable for things? So it really depends on how you're structured as well. And we'll go through that in a moment. But Generally you can be personally liable if you're bound under a contract or a court finds that that particular person is liable. So if you breach a contract personally, then you're going to be liable. If you cause damage or there's an accident with you personally, then you're going to be liable potentially for damages or to a debt. So the whole reason that we talk about structures and personal liability when it comes to a business point of view is you want to try to set up your structures the best way you can to protect those assets and reduce your personal liability. In business, if you set up, say, a company or a trust that runs the business or owns the assets, then you may have to sign during your business life what's called a personal guarantee. That's a document that a supplier will get you to sign if they're supplying to you goods on credit or some large service, whatever it might be. You're probably going to have to sign a personal guarantee. All the banks, those sorts of entities will make you sign a personal guarantee for credit cards for the business, overdrafts, those sorts of things. And that's where you become personally liable for those debts, as well as the company. Important to think about personal guarantees before you sign them. Make sure you keep a record of those personal guarantees, and because you might need to know which one's got a personal guarantee, which one doesn't. So important to think about personal liability when you're starting up your business and try to reduce where you can the personal liability for any debts. So yeah, that's personal liability. Jeremy, do you want to move on to structures?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we said, and Craig said, structures are very important for the startup. So there are 4 main structures that we're going to talk about today. The first one is a company. I'm going to cover that one. The second one is discretionary and family trust. Craig's going to cover that one. Unit trust is the third one, although they're becoming a little bit less prevalent, but we'll still talk about them. I'll talk about that, and then Craig will talk about partnerships. So companies. For anyone who is listening to the podcast, feel free to jump over to YouTube or our Facebook page and look for show 115, or go to businesslegallifecycle.com.au/115 to see copies of the slides, because these ones on structures do have some bearing to what we're talking about. So company is a separate legal entity. It's really important to understand that, because a company is separate from the people behind it. And if you're watching us, you'll see that we've got a slide up with a company, with a director and shareholders. These are the 2 basic roles of a company as a separate legal entity. So it's separate from the directors and it's separate from the shareholders. So the easiest way to think about these roles is the director has the day-to-day management of the company and can only be held liable in a few circumstances for directors' guarantees and insolvent trading. Shareholders really have no liability so long as their shares are paid up. So when you incorporate a company, not to get too technical, but you'll buy shares for a certain value, and those shares, the worth of those shares, once they're paid up, the shareholder has no more liability, but they're entitled to be paid the income and capital of the company, depending on the agreements between the parties. So company is a very common structure. Anyone who's in the legal profession or in the accounting profession will know that companies are used all the time as entities to run businesses, and that they've been around for 100 odd years, and that's the basic rules are limited liability for the shareholders and directors, and no liability for the shareholders, and a separate legal entity. Craig, do you want to talk about discretionary trusts?
Yeah, absolutely. So discretionary trust, if you're looking at it, you can see the slide there. So you've got the appointor, and that's the person that basically has control over the trust. They are able to appoint a new trustee, for instance. You then have the trustee. So the trustee is the trustee of the trust, obviously, and they acquire the legal ownership of the assets. Then you've got the actual trust, and underneath that, or within that, is the beneficiary. So they've got the beneficial ownership of the assets. And it's obviously a discretionary trust in most instances, which means that the trustee has the discretion in the trust as to what they do in terms of distributions, etc., etc. You've obviously got to follow the trustee, but in terms of they have the ultimate discretion as to what they're going to do. So it's a pretty important role when you're appointing a trustee. And obviously, you have the appointer in the background that's able to make some decisions there as well. So from an asset protection point of view, obviously, for the beneficiaries, it's great. It protects the assets there. It's probably the most popular structure, or becoming the most popular structure, normally with a company as the trustee rather than an individual. It's also important to know that the trustee obviously is as I said, the primary owner of the assets, and if the trustee owes a debt, then the assets can be attacked. So you need potentially to take some steps to change the trustee if you're able to. So it's an important structure to understand, something that most accountants will speak to their clients about when they're setting up a business. There are some added costs, obviously, with having these structures in place, but in the long run, it's definitely benefit the business owner. So discretionary trust, Jeremy, unit trust.
Yes, so this is very similar, and I just wanted to reiterate a point that Craig made there, and that's that the trustee, if your trust, whether it be discretionary family or a unit trust, and especially in the case of a unit trust, if it's going to be trading a business, so if it's going to be operating and dealing with the outside world, you should not be an individual trustee. You should have a company as your trustee, because as Craig said, that the trustee is individually liable for the debts of the trust. They just get indemnified out of the trust assets. So you don't want to be, if you've got a trading trust, you don't want to be an individual trustee. You want to make sure that you have a separate company entity that is the trustee of that trust. And as you can see from this slide that I've just brought up, if you're watching us, unit trust is very similar. The main difference is that rather than having beneficiaries, which are discretionary under a discretionary trust, that's the name, a unit trust is a bit like a company where you have unit holders, and the unit holders own a certain percentage of the units in the trust and are therefore entitled to the income and capital from the trust based on those units. You still have a trustee, you still have the trust, but this is an entity that is widely used and has fallen a little bit out of vogue at the moment. I know it's definitely in other countries like the UK, they don't use unit trusts as much. They still are used a bit here as a partnership vehicle, but if you are using a trust, just by virtue of it being a trust does not give you as an individual the protection if you're the trustee. If you're going to be a trading trust, then you must be a corporate trustee to give you that protection. Otherwise, you may as well be trading as a sole trader from a liability point of view. So Craig, do you want to talk about the last one, the partnership?
Yeah, so partnerships, not something that we come across much anymore. Obviously, partnerships used to be a lot of law firms, accountancy practices, those sorts of things. Most of them are moving away to more incorporated structures rather than a partnership. So a partnership is obviously two entities that come together, or more than two actually, but a minimum of two come together to form a partnership. So they don't have to be individuals that come together. It could be a partnership of companies that come together to form a partnership. As I said, it's not as popular as it once was. There are some disadvantages to a partnership from a liability point of view. So the partners are all fully responsible for the debts and liabilities. So that's one disadvantage. If you're ever thinking about a partnership, definitely get some advice about whether or not it's the best structure for what you're about to embark on. It might be that you're doing something in the property industry, like a joint venture, that a partnership might be useful there. But definitely something to think about and get the right advice about a partnership, because as I said, there are some disadvantages and there are better structures out there depending on your business. So yeah, that's partnership.
Great, thank you. So the next topic that we're going to talk about is leases. And so I'm going to talk about what is a lease and retail versus commercial and industrial and what that means. And then Craig and I are going to go through the leasing process to give you an understanding of what you need to do as a startup business to get a lease in place. So the first thing is, what is a lease? So a lease, if you don't know what it is, it's essentially the right to occupy a premises in exchange for a certain payment of rent or some sort of compensation. So yeah, if you're watching again on Facebook or YouTube or Periscope, you'll see a picture of a commercial premises. I'm sure the people who are listening to the podcast have seen them before. No doubt you've shopped there before. That usually the business will have a lease, and the lease will give them the right to occupy that premises for a certain period of time. Really important if you're going to open up an office, or you're going to have a retail premises, or you're going to have some sort of presence outside your own home, to have a lease in place. It is becoming more and more in vogue to not have a lease and to not lease alternative premises. I know in the dealings with Nigel from Peregrine in the UK, that's definitely something that they're moving away from over there. But leases are still important, especially in Australia, and they're still something that is important for businesses that want that kind of thing in their business. So the second point is, what's retail versus commercial and industrial, and why does that matter? Well, a retail lease is exactly what it sounds like. It's a retail shop. So think your Westfield shopping centres, or your supermarkets, or the shop that you go in to buy party supplies, or a local IGA, a local any local business that sells products to consumers is probably a retail lease. Commercial and industrial are more businesses, factories, all those kind of businesses. And why that matters is that in Australia, most states, and I know overseas too from the research I've done so far, have what we call retail shop leasing laws that actually put certain obligations on landlords and tenants in retail shop leases. Why is that the case? Well, in countries like Australia, we've had the rise of, and I know this is the case in other countries as well, of big supermarket chains or big chains of shopping centres that have a lot of bargaining power that a lot of people want to be in there. And so people have found that they've been wronged, rightly or they think they've been wronged. Whether that's right or wrong is a matter of debate, but they feel that they've been wronged because they haven't been given enough information. So the government's brought in legislation that says if you're a retail shop or you own a retail shop, you've got to comply with this legislation. So it's really important to get that distinction right. If you go to the retail shop leases regulations in Queensland, they are pages and pages and pages, and there's all these complicated rules about what is a retail versus a commercial lease. So make sure that you get the right advice if you're a tenant or a landlord to make sure that you understand what you're entering into. So Craig, do you want to kick off with the first slide on the leasing process?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the process. The first step in the process is obviously to find an actual premises. It's probably one of the most important steps in the process, to find at least the right premises. So you want to make sure that it suits what you need. You're going to get a lot of foot traffic. Do you need to be on a main street? What's the car parking like? All those sorts of things. And at that point as well, you'd be looking at your long-term goals or your short-term goals to make sure that the premises actually fits into what you're trying to do. There's no point finding a premise. Most of the time, you're going to have to sign up for a lease of 1, 3, 5 years, and if it's not going to suit your needs during that time, then it's probably not the right premises. So finding the premises is very important. Talk to a lot of agents, get out there, do your research, try to find the best premises. Once you find one that you're interested in, then the agent will start negotiating, and there'll be an offer to lease or an agreement or intention to lease document that's normally produced. It'll have the main sort of terms of what the lease is going to be, so the price, those sorts of things, how long it's for, the option periods, etc., etc. So it's important to have a look at that. Make sure you're happy with that before it's all signed off on. It'll then, down the track, form the actual lease, or be used to form the actual lease. So it's important that the offer to lease and the agreement to lease is how you want it to be. As part of that, there'll also be a deposit or some form of bank guarantee that needs to be provided. So the deposit could be 3 months rent or something like that, or it could be that it's a bank guarantee where the bank produces a document where you're basically guaranteeing to the landlord the amount that's under the bank guarantee. So it could be 3 months rent or some other figure. So it's important to understand the difference between the deposit, which is actually you handing over the money to the landlord or to the agent, whereas a bank guarantee doesn't involve you actually handing over the money to the agent, but it still requires you to have that money from the bank's point of view. So important to think about those sorts of things when you're looking at leasing. So that's the first 3 steps in the process. Jeremy, do you want to move on to the next?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So the next 3 are up on the screen now. And the first one is, what incentive can you get? So incentives become really important in leases because do you get a rent-free period? Do you get the landlord to do a fit-out in the premises? What do you get as an incentive for you to take that lease over another? Most landlords will give you some sort of incentive. Even the big guys, even the big shopping centres will often give you an incentive. So have a look at what incentive you can get. Negotiate that. Make sure that you're getting what you're comfortable with and what you can afford. The fifth item, the second one on this slide, the 5th one overall, is the length of the lease and the options. When you enter into a lease, It could be for a year, it could be for a month, it could be for 3 years, it could be for 5 years, it could be for 10 years. The length of the lease is the time that you'll definitely be able to operate your business. So you need to make sure that the lease that you put in place has the length that you want for the business. Starting up with an end in mind, as I talk about, is very important here. And that includes options. So these are options where you get the option to extend the lease for a period of time. So you might have heard or you might hear the terms like 3x3 leases. Excuse me. That means that you've got a 3-year lease and a 3-year option. So think about the length of the lease. Make sure that you understand that you're signing up for that length of the lease. You're liable for the length of that lease. So make sure that you're prepared to go ahead with the lease for that period of time. The 6th one is, what do you have to pay? This is really important and something that a lot of tenants miss out on. Because let's face it, when you get the entrepreneurial bug, you think that everything's going to be fine, but you need to work out what you're going to pay and how you're going to pay it. So what we're talking about here is your rent and outgoings. So the entrepreneurial bug bites and you think, yes, I'm going to make $1 million. You need to make sure that whilst you're working that business up and trying to develop that business, that you actually spend some time and work out how you're going to pay the rent, because too many businesses have failed because they weren't able to pay the rent early on. So that's really important. Think about what you've got to pay. Make sure you go and get advice. If you've got a retail shop lease, normally you're required to go and get financial advice. I recommend that you do it anyway to make sure that you can afford the rent, so that you're not left with renting a premises and not being able to actually use it or pay the rent. So Craig, that's the next 3. Do you want to go on to 7 through 9?
Yeah, absolutely. So number 7 is what happens if the premises are destroyed, and this sort of fits in with the next one as well. So you need to make sure that in the lease there's provisions about if something happens to the premises. And in particular, moving on to the next one, is about insurances. So most of the lease will have the minimum requirements that the tenant has to get in way of insurance. So there could be plate, glass, insurance, those sorts of things that you need to have as a minimum standard. So make sure you talk to your insurance broker and get what is required under the lease in place. The landlord or the agent will normally need to see the whatever it's called now, I can't even think of the name, the certificate of currency. Is that it? Yeah. Yep. During the process before you move in, to make sure you've got the minimum requirements for the insurance. One of the other things you need to consider is the default terms under the lease. So if you don't pay for whatever reason, or something happens and there's a problem with the premises, what are the default terms? What's the process that needs to be followed? Those sorts of things. So it's important to be aware of those before you go into the lease. As Jeremy said, seeking advice about the lease, whether it's a retail shop or a general commercial or industrial lease, you've got to get the advice before you sign on all these things, because once you sign it, it's very hard to get out of it. So as we always say at the Business Legal Lifecycle, make sure you get all your consultants together and get the financial, the legal advice about the lease before you sign up. So that's the 7, 8, 9. You want to do 10, 11, 12?
Yes, the last 3. So the last 3 things to consider, in our view, are number 10 is maintenance and repair. So this is talking about who has the obligation of maintenance and repair. A big part of this is air conditioning. I'm negotiating a lease right at the moment. This is August 2018, where this is an issue, and you need to make sure that the lease actually stipulates who has to maintain equipment, who has to repair it, and repair is different from replace as well. So you need to be really clear with who's got to do what in relation to maintenance and repair of the premises, so that there's no dispute later on, because these are disputes. You can have $500,000 worth of air conditioning in a premises, and if there's not an understanding over who's to maintain that and who's to do the work on it, then that can cause a lot of problems going forward. Number 11 is the end of the lease. So start up with an end in mind, as we say. Very important to understand what's going to happen at the end of your lease. Excuse me. You need to determine what exactly is going to happen, what you actually have to do. So if you're leasing on office premises, do you have to gut the premises and return it to an empty shell? Same with a retail shop. If if there's pre-existing walls in there, do you have to get those walls installed or reinstalled, or what do you have to do? So you need to be really clear with what happens at the end of the lease and factor that into your costs. At the end of your lease, you'll hopefully be moving on and moving to bigger, better premises, and there'll be a cost that you have to incur to actually make good that premises. So you've got to make sure that you cover that. And the last one is car parking. This is something that a lot of people don't think about until it's too late. Car parking, in 2018 anyway, is a massive problem in a lot of cities around the world. That may change, but for the time being, it's really important that you've got car parking that your customers and your employees can actually use. So they're the 12 steps that we see as the most important things to think about for the process of leasing. We're going to move now into insurance. So the next slide is, what is it? And then talking about a couple of types of insurance. And we're going to talk through some of the really important ones to have in place and what they mean. So Craig, do you want to talk about what is insurance and the first two types of insurance?
Absolutely, will do. So insurance, most people would understand or have had insurance policies in the past. So, obviously you sign up with an insurance company and there, basically if something happens, depending on the type of insurance, then if you've paid all your premiums and you've got a policy, there's no exemptions in place, then the insurance company will pay out under that insurance policy, hopefully. So it's a way of sort of protecting yourself. If something was to happen, depending on what it is, then you might have insurance that will cover off on that. So it's very important to consider insurance when you're starting up a business. We touched on it with the lease, where you're going to have requirements to have certain type of insurance for the premises. You also need to think about, and this depends on your business or what you're doing, as to what insurances you're going to need. We'd encourage everyone to look at and speak to a insurance broker and make sure you get the correct insurance, the correct level of insurance, those sorts of things, and make sure you're covered for all sorts of different events that might occur in your business. So generally there's a few insurances. I'm going to go through those in a little bit of detail, but you've got your general liability insurance, public liability insurance. Excuse me. Depending on your business, you might need product liability insurance. So if you're selling products or manufacturing, those sorts of things, then you're going to need insurance for that as well. So as I said, important to talk to your broker and make sure you've got the right insurance. Don't just go out there and get everything you possibly can, because it may not be relevant to your business. So think about it. So that's the first slide, Jeremy. You want to move on to the next one?
Yeah, so the next three types of insurance are professional liability. So this is very important for people in the professional services industry, whether you're a lawyer, an accountant, a financial advisor. Having professional liability insurance is there to protect you if you make a mistake. We're all human beings. We all make mistakes. Unfortunately, that does happen. We're not perfect, so we have professional liability insurance, which is there to protect you in case something goes wrong. The next one is workers' compensation. So this is if you have employees or contractors, then you need to have workers' compensation insurance. Essentially, it protects you if, in case, as a business owner, in case a worker is injured on the job, and make sure that they can be looked after, their medical bills paid, and any future economic loss is covered. Workers' compensation is compulsory in most states in Australia. In fact, I think it's all states in Australia. And a lot of countries in the Western world also require workers' compensation insurance. So make sure that you get that in place if you're going to have employees. Normally it doesn't cover the directors or the owners of the business. It's just the employees. So you'll need to think about getting your own other insurance if you're a sole trader. And we'll talk about that at another show. The last one is business interruption insurance. So if you live in Brisbane, where we live, 7 years ago, we had 7.5 years ago, we had the Brisbane floods, where a lot of businesses were interrupted due to flooding. And there was a lot of rain, and there was a lot of different businesses were shut down because of weather events. Business interruption insurance is usually there, and you've got to read the fine print, to protect businesses from the loss that they suffer whilst their business is interrupted due to unforeseen circumstances. These insurance policies, and Craig said it before, they have a lot of exemptions. So you need to make sure that you got the right one, and that's where an insurance broker becomes really important to make sure that you're getting the right advice and the right type of insurance policy for you. But business interruption insurance, very important to get right, and can really save you if circumstances do turn against you. So that's the 4 through 6. Craig, do you want to talk about the last 3 types of insurance?
Yeah, number 7 is motor vehicle or equipment insurance. So obviously, if your business owns any motor vehicles, you need to have the right insurance for that. and it needs to, particularly be for, commercial use of the vehicle or whatever it might be. Same goes with the equipment. If you've got equipment, you need to have insurance policies in place. If something were to happen to that equipment, damaged in any way, that you're covered for that damage and replacement or market value, or whatever it might be, with the policy. So make sure you look at that. Number 8 we have down is cyber insurance, which is obviously something that is becoming more and more prevalent. If you're in that sort of industry where you might be attacked from a cyber point of view, then you need to have that insurance in place that will help protect you and pay out any damages you might suffer if there's any cyber attacks or anything along those lines, because it's similar to, I guess, business interruption insurance, in that it will interrupt your business. Your server might be down or whatever it might be. You're going to have IT costs to recover that, those sorts of things, which would be covered under the insurance policy potentially, depending on the policy. And the last one that we had is Keyman Insurance. So it's important to think about the levels of insurance. If something was to happen to someone in the business, what would happen to that business? And if you've got an insurance policy in place, there could be some funds that are paid out that'll help you get through that part of the business if one of the key men or key men, or women, unable to operate in the business for whatever reason. So it's important to have those sorts of insurances in place. I think that's probably it for insurance, Jeremy.
Yep, great. We probably should change that to key person insurance for the future.
Yeah.
But it is colloquially known as Keyman Insurance. So that's insurance, and they're the 9 main types of insurance that we always recommend our startup businesses consider getting, depending on their business. So the final 3 topics that we're going to talk about today are government regulation, tax, and grants and funding. So in government regulation, we're going to talk about it in general. We're going to talk about some of the more important ones for startup businesses. Then in tax, we're just going to talk about the importance of tax, paying your tax. It's not your money, it's the government's money. And then we're going to talk a little bit about grants and funding and the importance of grants and funding. So the first one is government regulation. So what we're talking about here is that a lot of businesses around Australia and around the world are in industries that the government has chosen to regulate. Now, you may agree or disagree that your industry should be regulated, but if it is, then you don't have a choice but to comply with those regulations. Make sure that you're appropriately licensed. For instance, lawyers in Australia have to have an appropriate qualifications and an appropriate memberships and appropriate licenses to operate, and appropriate insurances too. Builders need to be licensed by the local, in Queensland, the Queensland Building Construction Commission. These bodies are set up and required to be, for people to trade in that business, are required to be members of them to basically stop the dodgy people from just doing work. It also ensures that the government and the public have a certain level of understanding and confidence in the industry. Imagine if anyone could set up shingle as a doctor, what could actually happen, or a surgeon. There'd be lots of problems if that happened, if you didn't have to have certain qualifications. So whilst red tape is a huge issue, and red tape gets worse and worse and worse every month, all the time, in some countries that they're trying to pare it down, government regulation does serve a purpose, and in the right circumstances it is necessary. But at the end of the day, unless you're going to lobby your local politicians to get rid of the regulation in your industry, you have to comply with it. So if you are going to go into an industry that is regulated, then make sure that you're researching what those regulations are. Talk to the government body that regulates it. Talk to an industry body. There are heaps of them around for almost every industry. I tried to think of for this show what an industry that doesn't have a body, and I can't think of one. Everyone has an industry body that is government regulated. Talk to these people, get some advice, and then make sure that you talk to your lawyer to make sure that what you're doing is right and that you've got the right licenses in place, because there are lots of pitfalls that you can fall into with government regulation. So that's government regulation generally. Craig, do you want to talk about misleading and deceptive conduct?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So misleading and deceptive conduct, it's around the Trade Practices Act that used to exist, which has been replaced by the Competition and Consumer Act. So essentially pretty common sense sort of stuff, to be perfectly honest, when it comes to this. If you're misleading and deceptive in any way when you're selling your goods or your services, be it through the way it's marketed, advertised, those sorts of things, or what it's supposed to do and it doesn't actually do that, then potentially you're going to fall foul of misleading and deceptive conduct legislation. So, common sense would say you're not going to do that, so you're going to think about it. But yeah, I guess this is important to be aware of it, that it's out there. Not everything's going to be governed by the legislation as well. You've got to fit into the particular legislation. It's not for every single possible good, so you need to make sure that you are as part of that, depending on your business and what you're selling, to the value, those sorts of things. But it's definitely something you need to be aware of. If you're doing any advertising or starting up a business, how you're marketing your product, those sorts of things, you've got to make sure you're not misleading and deceptive in any way in your conduct when you're running your business. So as I said, pretty common sense stuff. However, some people do fall foul of the legislation and get into some trouble. So make sure you're aware of it and seek the advice if you're not sure. Moving on, Jeremy.
Yes, food standards. So I'll be very brief about this. But if you're running a restaurant or a cafe or supplying food in any way, you have to comply with the food standards legislation. In Australia, that talks about the Australian Food Standards Code, which is uniform across the country. You have to comply with it. If you're not sure whether or not you do comply with it, make sure that you get advice. There are consultants who go and inspect premises. There are hefty fines, and rightly so, for companies that do breach the food standards protocol. And it's a zero tolerance policy from the courts and from the councils who enforce it. So if you're not sure, get some advice. Don't just take it as read that you've been approved in the past by the local government. Make sure that you get the right advice and that you regularly check to make sure you comply. You may not realise that a hole has formed in a wall that lets vermin through. You may not realise that the shop next door has shut down and left foodstuffs in there. I had that once where the shop next door shut down. Foodstuffs were left there, lots of vermin got in there, and then when they finished eating the stuff in the abandoned premises, they came over to the new one. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter from the court's point of view. Doesn't matter from the local council's point of view. And it doesn't matter from the public's point of view. You need to make sure that you're complying with those codes and that you're keeping your premises clean and pest-free. So that's all I'll say on food standards. Craig, Australian standards.
So Australian standards, there are a heap of different standards with all different numbers around the place. You will know if you're in that particular industry as to what standards and where to find the standards. So you need to follow those. There'll be manufacturing standards depending on the products, those sorts of things. It's important to be aware of that and to make sure you meet the minimum standard under the Australian standard. Because if you don't, then there's going to be some trouble. So be aware of the standards, make sure you're up to date with the standards as well, because they will change throughout time. Make sure you're up to date with them. I wouldn't just suggest just Googling and trying to find the standard. It's probably better to go to the actual source and get the most up-to-date standard to make sure you comply with it. So we put that in there more as if you're in that sort of industry, you'll be aware of the standards. And just to make sure that you're looking at those when you're starting up your business and put the process in place to make sure you follow the particular Australian standard. If you're in Australia, obviously, there'll be different standards for different countries and different places. So make sure you follow the standards in the jurisdiction. Jeremy, what was the next one? Codes of practice.
The next one is codes of practice. So here we're talking about, and probably the most famous example is the franchising code of practice. These are codes of conduct that are set down by government bodies as minimum standards required by different in different industries. So there's lots of different codes of practice. So you need to make sure that if you think that one applies to you, that you get some advice and that you make sure that you comply with its requirements. Often there can be requirements with a franchise, for instance, where you have to provide certain types of disclosure. So make sure that you get the advice and make sure that you're complying with the code of practice. Craig, let's go on to our second last topic of tax. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We all love this topic of tax. Obviously, it's something you can't avoid, or at least not for long. In business, you're going to have to pay tax at some point. So it's most important thing we find in terms of talking to business owners is to make provision for the tax. You are going to have to pay it eventually, so it's better to put some money aside now to make sure that you can pay your liabilities when they arise. So you talk to your bookkeeper and accountant about compliance, when things need to be lodged, those sorts of things. But it's the best idea is to make sure that you're putting aside some money now to make provision for tax in the future. Because as I said, it's very hard to avoid when you're starting up. It's very easy just to get all the money in and spend it on whatever else. But even if it's 10%, 1%, whatever it might be, putting something aside will make it a lot easier when the time comes where things need to be paid to the tax office. So the first one we wanted to touch on, Jeremy, was company tax.
Yeah, so this is company tax. This is tax that's basically paid by a company based on its profits. So you've got to pay it. It's one of those tax. It's a tax that has been up for a lot of debate in Australia and around the world recently about the rate. But it's going to exist for it's existed for a long time. It's going to keep on existing, and so you got to make sure you pay it. And as Craig said, with these types of taxes, you need to make sure that you're putting something aside to pay the tax, because whilst you may not know what it is, down the track you'll have to pay it, and so you don't want to have to be scratching around to try and find that money. So Craig, what about goods and services tax?
Yeah, good old GST, currently 10% in Australia on most goods and services, not all. So you've got to be aware of the fact that if you're collecting GST, that you will need to send that back to the tax office at some point through your business activity statement. Also, all the GST that you pay in your business, so you might buy a photocopy or whatever it might be, and there's GST on that, then that gets offset, and basically you pay the difference to the tax office. So talk to your bookkeeper and accountant about the best way of when to pay it. Is it monthly, quarterly, etc., and make sure you keep all your receipts so you can make sure you claim all the GST that you paid out and the GST that you've been paid. So basically, as a business owner, you're sort of collecting tax for the ATO from a GST point of view. So income tax.
Income tax is the final one that we're going to talk about today. There are others, but income tax, if you make money and you make it in your personal name, you're going to have to pay income tax. You have the best structure in the world, but you're going to have to pay income tax. We all do. There's nothing we can do to avoid it. So make sure that you get a good accountant who can make sure that you're not paying too much and you're paying the right amount. But income tax is basically the amount of money that you as an individual make from based on the income that you receive. Simple as that. Make sure you pay it. Make sure you provision for it. If you haven't paid, if you don't pay it during the year, if you don't collect it and pay it to the government as you go. But income tax is very important. So Craig, let's just quickly talk about grants and funding.
Yeah, absolutely. So grants, obviously, if you're in the particular industry where there are grants available, and there's a lot of them, there are grants available now, you'd be surprised how many there are. When you're starting out, or even when you're in business, important to look at those. Particularly when you're starting out, there might be a grant that you can obtain that'll help, fund the business startup, whatever it might be. So there are different ways of funding and grants. Jeremy's going to touch on grants advisors, which are pretty important in this space, and I think becoming more and more popular. But important to think about grants and funding and do some research there. So Jeremy, do you want to touch on advisors, grants advisors?
Absolutely. So this is, as Craig says, an industry and a consultancy that's coming more and more prevalent. And these are people who know the myriad of hundreds, if not thousands of grants that are out there, and can probably tell you what you can actually get. So normally they're people who have worked in the industry, probably worked for government, and seen the need that people need to know what's actually out there from a grant point of view. So go and get some advice from them. If you're not sure, go and get advice from multiple people. There's nothing wrong with getting different opinions. But if you think that you might be entitled to a grant, go and talk to a grant advisor, because they'll be able to answer your questions pretty well and guide you in the right way. They'll also most likely be able to help you to put together your application for the grant. That can be very important, because a grant is a government lot of money that you're getting, and so they want to check a bunch of boxes to make sure that you comply with their certain requirements. And so the grant advisors can ordinarily help you to make sure that what you're putting in place and what you're providing to the government actually has a chance of being successful, because all too often people just do it themselves and they miss really important points, and so there's no point in doing it yourself. You should get some advice from someone who knows what they're talking about. Craig, do you want to talk about the last slide today, which is specific funding bodies?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, there might be a particular funding body out there for your industry that'll be able to fund whatever it might be. It might be something specific. So you need to go out there, do the research, talk to people about particular funding bodies. Sorry. You'll notice that it's winter here in Brisbane, and both Jerry and I have got coughs and colds, so we do apologise and thank you for bearing with us. We're almost at the end. So, yeah, do the research about the funding bodies. Make sure that you're speaking to them. They might be able to fund part of the business or a particular project. So talk to them. And I think, Jeremy, as I said, we're at the end.
We are, Craig. So thank you everyone for watching. And as Craig said, thank you for bearing with us. It is the middle of winter in Brisbane, and there's quite a nasty little cold going around. So we do apologise for the coughing for anyone who's listening or watching us. But yeah, thank you for bearing with us. We think this is a really important topic. It's something that we want to make sure that you all understand. And because if you get this right, this will set you up for a really successful business. It really will. Yeah, we've seen it time and time again. It's one of the, anyone who's watched any of our previous 114 shows knows that we are very passionate about making sure people have successful businesses, and setting them up correctly is so important to that. It's so important to make sure that you set up correctly so that you're not disadvantaged for the future. Your goals may change. You may change some of your structures. You may change your lease. You may need different insurances. You may need to get rid of some of these things, but getting them right early on will set you up for success, and hopefully for a very successful journey through the business legal life cycle. So thank you very much for joining us. Apologies again for the coughing. That does happen. This is show number 115. So if you want to get our show notes from today, please go to businesslegallifecycle.com.au/115. We'll be back on Friday with our legal updater. There's been a few legal updates in July, so we're excited to go through those. And throughout the month, we're going to have some interesting interviews with authors and thought leaders. So please stick with us. And as always, please like our Facebook page if you haven't already. Please like this video. And if you're so minded, and you like our content, please go to iTunes, rate us on there, give us some reviews. It helps get the word out there about what we're doing and how we can actually help people. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you on Friday.
Thanks, everyone.